Good evening. Thank you for your patience. My name is Catherine Hay. I am a cultural program manager at the Department of Culture, and it is my great honor to welcome you to this evening's lecture, 175 Years of History, the Portuguese in Bermuda. I just wanted to acknowledge some special guests. Minister Owen K. Darrell, JP, the Minister of Tourism, Culture and Sport, who has been a stalwart in supporting our celebration of the 175th anniversary of the arrival of the Portuguese in Bermuda. Andrea Monas de Souza, the Honorary Consul of Portugal and Bermuda, President of the Azorean Emigrant Association, and Chair of the 175th years anniversary Portuguese in Bermuda Commemorations Committee. There we go. And you have to please not laugh at my pronunciations. I am working on it. So, Lucia Botelho, President of the Casa das Açores de Bermuda. Thank you. And we also want to welcome members of the 175th anniversary Portuguese in Bermuda Commemorations Committee. Without further ado, the Minister would like to share some welcoming remarks.
Thank you, Mrs. Hay. First of all, I'd like to say I apologize for the tardiness of my arrival. Hello, former Premier. How are you? And how are you, okay? I was at another event, and as you would know, that getting out in the community and supporting the events of which our departments actually put on are very important to me. So before I came here, the other department under my ministry, the Department of Sport and Recreation, were opening their summer day camp program. And the way it was set up, it was almost at the other end of the island. So we did come, and then with the rain and stuff. So that's why I'm a few minutes late. Thank you for indulging me. I want to say hello to a lot of the faces I would have seen about a month ago. Was it, Mr. Medeiros? About a month ago, we were at the opening of the art exhibit with Portuguese or Azorean artists up at the Bermuda National Museum. And that was a good time, and I actually was able to engage in some of you there as well. So with that said, I want to say thanks for coming, and I'll get into my official remarks. Good evening. What an exciting night we have ahead of us. We're here for another fantastic installment of what we call our Bermudian Heartbeats series. It's truly a pleasure to kick off tonight's lecture, 175-year history of Portuguese in Bermuda. We're diving into the incredible journey and the lasting influence of the Portuguese community right here on our island. We are particularly honored to have with us, as Ms. Hay already pointed out, Mr. Eduardo Medeiros, a distinguished Azorean historian and author. He will share his extensive research on how the Portuguese have not only shaped, but also enriched Bermuda's cultural and social landscape. His work, commissioned by the Azorean Emigrant Association and supported by the 175th Anniversary Commemoration Ceremony Committee of Portuguese Emigration to Bermuda. It's crucial to understanding the layers of our shared histories. This research will soon culminate in a book that marks significant anniversary of the arrival of the first Portuguese immigrants to our shores on November 4th, 1849, aboard the ship, the Golden Rule. I'd like to take a moment to recognize key individuals, as Ms. Hay already has, but these individuals have been instrumental in making tonight's talk possible. So Mr. Richard Ambrosio, the chair of the Portuguese Cultural Association and the Vasco da Gama Club, has been the driving force behind this lecture. Although he's off island and cannot be with us tonight, his influence and dedication are evident in our gathering here tonight. Ms. Andrea Monas de Souza, the Honorary Consul of Portugal and Bermuda, and the President of the Azorean Emigrant Association, as well as the chair of the 175th Anniversary of Portuguese in Bermuda Commemorations Committee. She deserves a special mention. And finally, Ms. Lucia Botelho, President of the Casa das Açores de Bermuda, has also shown pivotal leadership. The Portuguese community in Bermuda has profoundly shaped our island's heritage through the skill, traditions, and stories. They introduced the advanced farming techniques, transforming our agricultural landscape and establishing vital economic avenues. Bermudians of Portuguese descent are now in every sector of our society. And those of you that were at the event in Dhaka would have heard me say this, and I think it's important to say it again. And they contribute as stewards and stewards of our shared future. Tonight's gathering is a celebration of the enduring bond between Bermuda and the Portuguese communities of the Azores, Madeira, Portugal, and Cape Verde. This connection enriches our community, introducing diverse perspectives and reinforcing the connections that make Bermudian culture unique, robust, and dynamic. I extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Portuguese Cultural Association for their invaluable assistance in making Mr. Medeiros' visit possible. Tonight, as we listen to the stories and the milestones that define the Portuguese influence in Bermuda, let us also reflect on the broader narrative of our island, a narrative enriched by each community that calls Bermuda home. Thank you for joining us this evening, and let us continue to embrace our shared history and look forward to forging new paths together. Thank you. And I just wanted to point out, and these are not in my remarks, so I'm sorry, Ms. Hay, I'm about to take your program left for 1 second. I was at another meeting last night, and what's interesting is that these celebrations are ongoing, and I want to commend all of you for any particular piece that you are playing in the celebrations. I was in a meeting and someone had a flyer. I think it's an event. Is it this weekend? It's an event this weekend, and I knew I had this event, and then there was the art museum, and there are going to be more. And I made it a point to tell the individuals in the room that I said this, and these are events that must be supported, and these are events that are going to be ongoing. I assume throughout the year. It was interesting to hear them say, "Oh, there's an event this weekend." I'm like, there are going to be many events, and I encourage them to go to as many as possible. He will arrive soon. I know he had issues with his daughter, but my colleague is going to be joining me. I did particularly invite him. I know he's been to Casa de Azores many times, and that is my colleague, MP Joshe Adams. So when he does come, I'm not going to interrupt the program, but I just want to acknowledge him as he will be arriving very, very shortly. Thank you very much, Ms. Hay. I'll turn it over to you. Looking forward to it.
It's me again. Thank you, Minister Darrow. It is my great honor to introduce Mr. Eduardo Medeiros, our esteemed speaker for this evening. Eduardo was born in 1996 in São Jorge. Thank you, guys. Ponta Delgada, Azores. Holds a degree in history and a master's in international tourism management from the University of the Azores. He is currently a historian for the Azorean Emigrants Association and a tour guide for the Into the Wild Azores tour. Eduardo is, amongst other things, also an accomplished author, having published 2 history books, and is passionate about music, playing guitar in the rock band Moby Islands. He enjoys reading, caring for animals, agriculture, and movies. Please, let's give a warm welcome to Eduardo Medeiros.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, back in Bermuda, after last year everyone was here. And of course, first of all, I wanted to thank to the Bermudian government, to the Department of Culture, to the 175 Years Committee, to Andrea Manes, because this idea first came out from her. From big thank you to Richard Ambrosio. He is not here, but it was also thanks to him, it's possible for me to be here. Mrs. Catherine Hay, Hannah League as well, and also Casa dos Açores, Vasco da Gama Club, and the Portuguese Cultural Associations. So, Mrs. Catherine already made an introduction about myself, and just wanted to also thank for all of you to be here on this event. And it's very nice to see people I've met last year. And of course, I want to say a special thank you to all the people that were available for me for the interviews and to help me. And of course, a very special thank you to Mrs. Susanna Meral and Anna Faria. She's not here, but both of these ladies were very helpful for this research for the book. So I'll start first to talk about the book, about the research, how all the steps I took, how it started. So this book, the research started in July 2022. That's when I finished the book of Azores, Canada. It was my second book, and so I started to do research for the book of Bermuda. So first of all, I did research in the archives of Ponta Delgado for passports, and also newspapers from the Azores, and then also there are some passports that are online from the district of Angra do Heroísmo, and there was a district of Horta and Fayal. And then on January, I arrived at Bermuda, and I did research until March 23, and I left in the first days of April back to the Azores. Here, I did research in Bermudian archives, so I went through passports, minutes from the government, cabinet minutes, executive council memos, etc., etc. And of course, I also did research on the newspapers in the Bermuda National Library, and of course, interviews with people from the Azorean Portuguese community, and of course, some Bermudians as well. So in April 2023, that's when I started to do the writing, and I'm still doing it right now. And on October 2023, I went to the mainland as well, Portugal mainland, because I went there to present the book, and I wanted to do research on the archives from the Foreign Affairs Ministry, which was very helpful. And also, of course, the Royal Gazette, most of it's online, and I've done research online from the Azores as well. So right now, the book in 2024, it's 536 pages. There are some more, and even more than 100 pages of records of passports, all the names of people that emigrated to Bermuda. So to start about the book itself, these are the chapters of the book. Of course, they divide in other ones. And today I'll focus especially in the 4th and 5th and the 6th chapter. So about the first the chapter, of course, I'll talk about a bit about Portugal, Portuguese Empire, the Azores, Madeira, the settlements, and how the Azores emigrated to basically a little bit of all over the world. There is Azoreans in Hawaii, Canada, United States, and of course here in Bermuda. Then, of course, one thing I found out is that people in the Azores, because this book is going to be in Portuguese and in English, people don't know much about what's Bermuda, what's the size of Bermuda, and what the history of Bermuda. So I'll write about that a bit. And then, of course, as I said, I'm going to focus on these three topics, and I'll start with the number 3. Okay, so first topic, it's Portuguese in Bermuda in the 16th century. So I'm talking about 1500s. And there were 3 main topics I'm going to talk about on this book. So first one is Estevão Gomes. Estevão Gomes was from the city of Porto, and he was the first Portuguese to get in contact with Bermuda. So it happens that Estevão Gomes worked for Fernando Magalhães, but he abandoned him, and then he went on a little trip looking for a way to reach Asia through the United States. And happens that he passed by Bermuda after going to Cuba. So that's the first Portuguese that got some contact with Bermuda, but working for the Spanish as well. Also working for the Spanish, we're talking about Fernando Camelo. So Fernando Camelo, an Azorean, a noble from San Miguel, was the first human to receive authorization to sell people in Bermuda by the Spanish king, Carlos V. But as far as we know, never got to sell here in Bermuda. And then, of course, one topic I'll talk about is from Spanish rock to Portuguese rock. So nowadays we know that in 1543 there was a ship that got shipwrecked in Bermuda, and it stayed for more than a month. And this ship was a Portuguese ship, was a slave ship that took sold slaves in Haiti nowadays, and then going back to the mainland, got lost and shipwrecked in Bermuda, and they stayed 1 year. So what happens associated with this, please, thank you. What's associated with this ship is the Portuguese rock. So, considering what I read about the Portuguese rock, I would say that the main issue behind Portuguese rock is discrimination against Portuguese. I'm going to explain you why. So with the evidence that we have so far, We know that in 1543 they got shipwrecked, but as Edward Harris from the National Museum of Bermuda says, it's hard to understand how an inscription in the stone could last for so many centuries, considering the nature of Bermuda stone. And also the theory that's written in Latin doesn't make any sense, because most of these sailors didn't know Latin. They spoke Portuguese, and even some of them couldn't even read or write. So what happens is that it amazes me how they could associate Fernando Camelo, who was Portuguese, to that inscription, and still call it Spanish rock, because Fernando Camelo was Portuguese as well. And also it shows a little bit of lack of knowledge about the sailing industry, sailing adventures, because there were even some Portuguese sailors working for the English Navy, like Fernand Liverpool, who reached what's nowadays Greenland. So, and then first, all the Portuguese are only introduced in the 19th century, so 1800s, and there were questions I made to start this research. So, why did Bermuda need to import labor from abroad? Why Portuguese immigrants, and specifically from Madeira, and why did the Madeiran people need to immigrate, besides the normal argument of in search for a better life? So first I did some research about the economic situation in Bermuda, and what happens is that self-production and the trade was not as important as it used to be. Shipbuilding industry was becoming way different, more steamships instead of sail ships, so less wood use of wood, and also the War of 1812. So War of 1812 clashed the United States against the Great Britain, and so William Reed was going to be the government was worried about Bermuda needing to produce its own food. Then in Madeira you have Robert Cayley and the Protestant faith in Madeira. So perhaps Robert Cayley was a Scottish doctor, and he went to Madeira because of his wife's health issues. And what happens is that he started to spread the Protestant faith amongst the Madeiran people. So for us seems normal, but it was not normal for Portuguese, for Portugal in 1830s. That's when we went there, because according to the Constitution of 1826 of Portugal, was forbidden for everyone that was not Portuguese. For everyone that was Portuguese to have other religion besides the Catholic. So everyone that was Portuguese had to be Catholic. Only foreigners could be Protestant, but they could not spread their faith to all the people who are not Catholics. So one interesting thing I just bring here is two pictures, is that the temples that were not Catholic could not have the shape of temples. So no crosses, no towers, no bells, nothing. So here are two examples. This is in the city of Ponta Delgada. Here at the left, it looks like a normal house, right? That's a Jewish synagogue. And to the right, that's an evangelical church in Ponta Delgada. So they don't look like temples because of these laws that we had in the 1800s. So what happens is that when Robert Cayley started to spread his faith, he got a lot of supporters, and many Protestants started to be prosecuted, beaten, arrested, and even houses were burned and people were killed. And he ended up fleeing with his wife to England. What happens is that meanwhile, slavery was abolished in the British Empire, and they needed cheap labor. So many Protestants, Madeirans, emigrated to the West Indies in search for religious freedom and, of course, for a better life. And so what happens is that in the 1834, so the year when slavery is abolished, already some Azoreans are going to Trinidad to replace the slaves. And then in the 1840s, hundreds and hundreds of Madeirans go to West Indies, like places like St. Vincent, Trinidad, especially Guyana and Antigua. So why did they need in those places Madeiran immigrants? So first of all, cheap labor for agricultural work, for sugarcane plantations, and of course for the cocoa and coffee. And also one thing I found out too in the case of St. David's, it's not here, but it's also one place where they went, St. Vincent, I'm sorry, was to increase the white population versus the African population. So that's to increase the white versus the black. And also Madeiran immigrants were hardworking class of people, cheap labor, and from a similar climate, and also peaceful. And of course in the West Indies also, not only here in Bermuda, but places like Trinidad, Antigua, Madeirans were discriminated, and they were even used that word that's also used here in Bermuda, Portuguese, and they were even also banned from similar clubs, and they founded their own clubs as well, like in Trinidad and many other places where they immigrated. So also in Madeira, what was happening that the economy was damaged by the Portuguese Civil War in that period, and 1847 was a big year of hunger, and also the price of wine had decreased. And of course, also immigration, just like in the Azores, was a way to escape the army services. And so, as I say here, problems in Madeira, plus the end of slavery in the British Empire, around 18,000 Madeirans emigrated to the Americas between 1834 and 1852. So it was this previous experience that made Bermuda to choose Madeirans to immigrate. So 1839, we have William Reed arriving at Bermuda. And he starts with this policy to introduce European immigrants for agriculture, for the reasons I mentioned. And so in 1845, they approved a grant of money to people to introduce immigrants in Bermuda. And so why introducing immigrants in Bermuda? Here's what he said in his speech. It's not much so from the amount of additional labor, but because from these persons bringing with them habits of active industry, improved methods of applying manual labor, and combining it with the labor of cattle and mechanical contrivances. So it was not more for more arms, it was like an importation of knowledge, a knowledge for how to work the field, how to work in agriculture. And so also 1846, Charles Eliot arrives, the new government, and he comes to replace the previous one that came after William Reed. And this year also people started to ask to introduce some English. And then 1847, the Parliament approves a sum of £400 to introduce immigrants in Bermuda. Out of this money, some German, some English, and of course 58 Madeirans will be introduced in Bermuda. And of course, already in 1847, I saw in Royal Gazette people hearing about these good results of Madeiran immigration in Antigua and Grenada, and also, as you can see, how they were cheap labor. They can live entirely on onions and potatoes. And so here, yes. So here is an advertisement on August 14th, 1849. They were planning to send Golden Rule, and also it says in those articles in 1849, say, well, Madeira has a similar climate to Bermuda. Well, Madeira is definitely hotter than the Azores. And also, they show up a report of Lord Harris, which was governor of Trinidad, and he talks about the success of Madeira people in Bermuda. And that's why then they sent on the September 1849 Golden Rule to Madeira. And of course, I established in contact with a historian in Madeira. I found out the date that the Golden Rule arrived at Madeira. It was we didn't know, and they got there on October the 2nd. And then they came back. They probably catch much better wind because they just took 21 days to come back, and they took around 30 to reach. And they arrived on November the 4th with 58 immigrants, amongst them 7 children and 16 women. So of course, Washington, who was the captain of the Golden Rule, had to give a voucher with the names of the people who introduced these immigrants and the names of them, and this of course is in the archives, that's where I got it. And one thing I also found out that was that's said in Bermuda, and it's not entirely true, is that people say that the onion, the seeds for the onion were brought with the Madeiras. That's not entirely true, because in the 1820s and then 1840s as well, I found Madeiran seeds from onion in 1820s and even 1830s and the 40s from the Azores as well. So there were these seeds from the Azores and Madeira before the immigrants had arrived. They came through New York and the US most. So in the second half of the 1800s, so Madeirans arrived really in 1849, just the last year of the first half. And so in 1850s, more grants or money are used to introduce immigrants in Bermuda. Pearl was sent, it's a ship, but got lost, never came back. In 1862, that's when the Board of Immigration is formed. So the main goal was to introduce immigrants from these places: Great Britain, Ireland, Channel Islands, Germany, Madeira, or they call it the Western Islands, the Azores. And so by 1865, The same captain that took Golden Rule is sent to Europe again to get more Portuguese immigrants. But this time, not from Madeira. He went to the mainland, he went to Porto, he sent someone to Lisbon, but didn't have any success. Then he tried to have some success in the Azores, establishing contacts, but still no success. So Washington then went to Germany, and was hard because he said everybody just wants to go to America and they want to come here. But if he had previous preparations, probably he could have gotten more people to hear, but he didn't succeed. So 1870s, we have Swedish immigrants that are introduced in Bermuda, and they're quite successful. The only problem is that's how to keep them. So for example, in the late 1870s, they made a new Immigration Act to give bonuses to Swedish immigrants to remain in Bermuda. But in 1876, there is something that's very interesting, that the Modesta was a British ship coming from the Azores, stopped in Bermuda in distress. And what happens is that around half of the people on those ships were illegal immigrants. They were not legal. And I did find the record of this ship in the Azores, and I found their names of the people that came legally. And they were later found out, most of them were already living in the US, and even kids born in the US. And so they didn't have any success in making contracts with the people from the ship. But what we know is that already in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, still just some years after this Modesta stopped, Azoreans started to arrive to Bermuda, but from the US. I only started to find records of Azoreans coming to Bermuda from the Azores in 1880. So most of them came to Bermuda illegally in whaling ships, Azoreans and Cape Verdeans. And then in 1870s, 80s, and 90s, they went to the US, stayed there the winters, and then came back. They went to the US, stayed there, and then on winters came to work in Bermuda because they didn't have much jobs during winter and on the US. That happened, for example, with some people interviewed, like Mr. Trevor Noah's ancestors. They were living in the US and then came to Bermuda, and that happened also with Tacitus Sayers, the MP and minister that was also Azorean descent, and many other cases. And so it was something common, this back and forth of Azoreans, Bermuda, US, during winter especially. So 1880s, Azoreans started to ask to introduce relatives in Bermuda, and I found records of Azoreans already in the 1800s from almost all the islands except for Corvo and Terceira. So from São Miguel, Santa Maria, São Jorge, Graciosa, Fiala, and Flores. In 1883, that's the start of the Portuguese consulate in Bermuda with John Estero that stayed until 1922. So 39 years. I'm pretty sure no other consul is going to remain for so much time. So in 1880s and 1890s, say we started to have some requests to introduce people from the Azores. You can see there from the Azores right here, one female domestic servant named Maria de Gloria, and I found some of these records on the Bermuda archives. And of course, in the late 1800s, Mr. Nicholas Lusher took several pictures of what was Bermuda, and part of Bermuda, of course, the Portuguese community. So he has here some pictures of Azoreans there, and that's last one on the left. Who gave him that picture was his great-grandson, Mr. Arthur da Silva, and that's his family. His great-grandfather came from Graciosa to the US, married the girl from Fayal, and came to Bermuda. And also what I found out from reading a book by Linda da Silva was that how Portuguese started the Protestant church here, which is definitely not common. So what happens is that Manuel Cordeiro Benevides was from São Miguel, was converted to Protestant faith in São Miguel by Henry Maxwell Wright, which was British Protestant. And he came here and started to spread the word and convert more Portuguese to the Protestant faith. So many Portuguese here in Bermuda in the late 1800s were Protestants. So for example, this church that has been demolished was the one he reconstructed. And then in the 1920s, they constructed one in Southampton. That's nowadays Calvary Gospel Chapel. And then over there, one Evangelical Church of Bermuda nowadays. So it surprised me because when people always think about the Azoreans, it's Catholic faith. But it's not always like this. So many Portuguese people became Protestant, and their services were celebrated in Portuguese, unlike the Catholic Church, which was in Latin. And also to keep in the Evangelical Church, was a way to socialize with other Portuguese. So the 20th century, that's of course the most important topic of the book, and it has more pages. So in 1900s and 1910s, the first decades, I didn't find much people immigrated from the Azores according to the passports. What I did find here in Bermuda was them applying to become naturalized British subjects. So they wanted for Bermuda to be their new home. And also, again, in this century already, there was still this back and forth of people living, Azoreans going back and forth to the US and to Bermuda. So in the newspapers, they say that there are 414 Portuguese people living in Bermuda, but there are much more people that more or less live in Bermuda. So they were living here and then going back to the US and Bermuda, back and forth, all during the agricultural season. And one interesting thing is that they were listed as citizens of the US. And as he says, and as the Royal Gazette says, and I quote, but nevertheless, they are Portuguese. So when he means that they are Portuguese, he's talking about Portuguese as a race, because the citizens of the US are Americans, are not Portuguese. He's talking about them, their ethnic background, and even as a specific race. And also in the beginning of the 20th century, you have some black Bermudians emigrating to the US and being replaced by Portuguese in the fields, in agriculture. So Portuguese were not only replaced in agriculture because of their talents, but because black people left for jobs in the towns and even in the US. But then, of course, what happens in the late 1800s and 1900s, agriculture started to become weaker. And because of competition from southern states like Texas, producing onions and exporting them to New York especially. And besides Bermudian immigration, we have the development of tourism that contributed to have less Bermudians in agriculture for a simple reason. Here's a quote I took from the Royal Gazette. It's easier to drive a carriage for 3 or 4 months than the rest of the year. So tourism started to take labor from agriculture. So when I saw that, I just say, well, Bermudians definitely are very intelligent and smart, because instead of working with so much sun and hard work, they just went with the wagons carrying people and showing Bermuda around, while Portuguese, of course, couldn't speak English, so they just had to work on what they knew. And then, of course, we started to have some businesses that belong to Portuguese, or Portuguese descent. So J.J. Monas already had a small factory to can tomatoes. And so it's interesting how this connection between agriculture and industry. And also, he had already a store on Front Street, and then he opened a new one called Bermuda Fruit and Grocery Store. And one thing is that, yes, many of them were illiterate, couldn't even write or read English, but as they say on Royal Gazette, horse sense to make money. I will say that still nowadays. But when their main concern in those days was that these Portuguese were buying up many fields, many lands, and didn't know how to read or write in English. And it's interesting and funny to see them answering, Portuguese answering to these news. They say, okay, I don't speak English, but tell me what, do you speak Portuguese? Do you write Portuguese? Well, my kids, they speak both. So in 1920s, that's one of the decades when immigration, we had more Azorean immigration coming to Bermuda from the Azores for many reasons. United States close to immigration. So this United States in the 1920s, we're talking about the United States where the president himself said America must be kept American. And when he said that, he meant America must be kept white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And so in the 1920s, the United States made its immigration according to the ethnic background of the population, to get more people from England and Ireland and Germany instead of Portugal, Spain, and Italy, which was a huge attack on the Azorean immigration, which made way less possible to go to the Azores. And so Bermuda comes out as a new opportunity. And so 1922, because of all of this lack of people to work in agriculture, Bermuda creates the Immigrant Labor Board. And so its goal was to negotiate with British or foreign governments to bring immigrant workers. So part of their plan was already to introduce between 100 and 150 immigrants, and then in 1923, the first Azoreans arrived. So in 1923, as you see right here, on a Good Friday, March 13th, 96 people arrived at St. George's. And then, of course, throughout the 1920s, were hundreds and hundreds of Azoreans coming to Bermuda to work in agriculture, and even some of them to work in the new Gulf course in Tuckerstown, and then in the 1930s also to Castle Harbor Hotel. So, for example, John Fall was a man who was sent to the Azores to get some workers from to work in the Castle Harbor and Tuckerstown project. And it's also interesting that in the archives in Ponta Delgada, I found many files even with pictures of these immigrants that arrived in 1923. So 1930, as I said, when some Azoreans and English leave Bermuda, the ones that came from Castle Harbor Hotel, then they left, they went back, and then other ones throughout the 1930s went back, and some came back. And so it's interesting that they sometimes took the direct ships to come back to the Azores. So during World War II, even during this war, there was immigration from the Azores. And so it's interesting that 1940, where the war has broken out, and Bermuda wants to just send them back. Just send them back because we don't need immigrants right now, but there was a problem of transport, how they were going to build to transport these people with these German submarines around. So that was a problem. And meanwhile, the farmers say, well, we'll need them for the crops, and so they stay. And so what happens is that during World War II, agriculture became very important again because the world was isolated, and so they needed to produce more of their own food. So in 1941, the Board of Immigration, in order to keep workers in agriculture, threatened to deport those who had been in Bermuda since 1936 and who were not in agriculture. And I'll explain more why they fled, why they were escaping from agriculture. And then in October 1941, Azorean workers arrived on the flying boats of Pan American Airways from Horta, Fayal. So Horta, it's a small city in the island of Fayal. And they had, please before the last one, they had the first airport. And I'm pretty sure it's in 1941, that's when Mrs. Johnny Pereira's father got here in 1941 on the flying boat that landed at Darrell's Island. In the 1940s, there was this big connection between the flying from Horta to Bermuda on direct flights in the flying boat. So in 1942, more Azoreans immigrants arrived on the ship Serpa Pinto, which carried some refugees to America. And also, it's interesting that it will take, in 1944, Serpa Pinto took more people from the Azores, but down to Bermuda, to Philadelphia. And then from the US, they took a plane to Bermuda. And also, please, that one. Thank you. What happens is that many Portuguese continue to leave their jobs because they were analphabet, couldn't read or write most of the times, and even if they couldn't read or write Portuguese, even worse, English. And so they signed many times contracts for lower wages. And so, for example, there were Bermudians getting like £4 a week, and Portuguese, because they just signed those contracts, they were earning like £2 a week, sometimes so half. And so when they found out, they just changed their jobs. And that's why then the Board of Immigration started to threaten them with deportation because they were leaving these jobs that were being low paid. And also one story from Serpa Pinto, and it shows that life was never easy, and was never easy. Still isn't for anyone. But in Serpa Pinto, I found the story of a lady that her husband immigrated to Bermuda in the 30s. He went back after 7 years. She got pregnant, and he came back, and 7 years later, he gets money enough to take her on the Serpa Pinto to the US. And she stays in the US in Philadelphia. The gentleman here in 1944 in Bermuda is so happy that his wife and his kids is coming from the Bermuda. But guess what? He goes through a surgery, he passes away, and then days after she comes here and she knows that after being around 14 years separated from her husband, he has passed away. 1945 between 1949. This was a very special period because this was one of the most important periods of Portuguese immigration to Bermuda. I'm going to explain why. So in 1947, new conditions are set for Azorean immigration to be imported in very harsh conditions, very hard. They had to be like between 30 and 45 years. They had to be married. Why? To be married, so to make sure they didn't marry any Bermudian woman and didn't apply for citizenship and couldn't buy land. And what happens is very funny, that King Horn was the director of border agriculture, and Mr. Abel Benovich, they go to the Azores to select these immigrants on these very harsh conditions. But guess what? It failed, because in that same year, the Estado Novo, which was a dictatorship, forbidden immigration completely. So no passports were issued for immigrants in those days. Why? Because the dictatorship wanted to organize the immigration according to their own interests, especially to get more people, more Portuguese people from the mainland Azores, Madeira, on the African colonies, which was something the Azores never cared much for. And in 1945, and also, 1948, considering these problems with Portuguese immigration in Bermuda and the desire of Bermuda to introduce more immigrants, Portuguese government sends a consul, an assistant consul from New York to Bermuda, Nuno Bacelão. She's that gentleman over there on the left. And he comes here, and Bermudian governments are suspicious why he's coming here. They think, oh, maybe they heard that we've been treating them badly. So that's why they're here now. So this gentleman, he went from St. George's Dockyard to inspect how things were working. And what's interesting is that he talks with agricultural workers, farmers, government officials, and he was just wanting to get more and more information to compare Bermuda to other places. So in the next decades, Portugal is sending thousands of Portuguese to Canada, Portuguese to African colonies, Australia, and other places. And one thing he says that he criticized Bermuda, and he says the following sentence that might be a summary of a little bit of the Board of Immigration policy. Bermuda doesn't want immigrants, but agricultural workers. So they didn't want people to stay, just wanted people to work and then go back home. So in 1948, Executive Council approves the policy of the Board of Immigration to allow the coming of Bermuda for the wives and families of Portuguese citizens who have resided here for 7 years or more. And then in 1949, through negotiations with Maurice Gibbons, who was president of the Band of Bermuda at the third time and was Portuguese vice consul, it was possible to import more 100 Portuguese workers through letters of call, called cartas de chamada. And one thing to make sure that these people were not going to be abused is that they could only be called by Portuguese people or Portuguese organizations. Portuguese organizations, of course, I'm talking about Vasco da Gama. And so in 1949 also, in this same year, the first Portuguese and Azorean to be vice consul of Portugal in Bermuda, Eduardo Medeiros, he was from Ralph in San Miguel. And of course, arrival at Bermuda, that's the Pereira family. And in 1949, we have one of the most influential generations to arrive here at Bermuda. So we're talking about Johnny Pereira, who later started the NJ. We're talking about Luis Bernard, community leader, architect, was in politics as well in UBP, Eddie de Mello, community leader, music business, and of course, Tony Cordero, unfortunately passed away last year as a photographer for real design. So in the 1950s, Azoreans kept coming to Bermuda for agriculture and reforestation. So it happened that Bermuda had problems with cedars dying, and so they had to cut all of these cedars and replace them from other trees. That's what happened, for example, with Mr. José Amaral, who later started Amaral Farms. And so he came in 1952, and so that's a news from Correio dos Açores. That's a newspaper on in San Miguel Island, of many Azoreans coming here for this kind of works, and also working for the corporation and for all of these farms. And what's interesting too, that we have also direct flights from Santa Maria Island, 8 hours from Santa Maria Island on the Constellation to Bermuda. And then in 1950s, the Portuguese government again sends a new inspector to see how things were here on the island in Bermuda and the conditions about the Portuguese working here. And of course, also João César Guiar is appointed as the new Portuguese vice consul. And Carlos Fernandes, he sees here in Bermuda a community of 4,000 people, and they're split in two groups. Protestants, they were already met, most of them were in Bermuda, and the Catholics, immigrants. So many times, I heard Bermudans say, Portuguese are so united here in Bermuda. Well, I don't know much about that, but I can tell you that's on the Portugal mainland, on the archives. I found many documents of people, Catholics, complaining But the Protestants, for example, one very interesting and funny document I found was one Azorean complaining to, I think it was to Salazar. Everywhere we look, there are Protestants. We need a Catholic priest that speaks Portuguese here in Bermuda. And so where this also, the Protestants were also had this kind of rivalry with the Catholics too, because they just saw like these hundreds and hundreds of Catholics coming here, and were of course threatening their success on one hand, and also on the other one working for them. And even in the to choose a Portuguese council was hard, because they couldn't choose one who was Protestant that could speak English and could speak Portuguese, because the Catholics wouldn't like him. That happens sometimes. So in 1955, to what happens that in those dates, Portugal again interrupts immigration to Bermuda, and then only in 1955 an agreement is reached. So Mr. Chaplin, that was the colonial secretary, South African, goes to Lisbon to negotiate a new agreement, and then only in 1957 the Portuguese government signs the agreement. Minimum wage of £7 a week with food and lodging, but no wives and families coming to Bermuda. So in the late 50s, they have these two gentlemen who were very important for the Portuguese community. I found out Maurice Gibbons and Henry Vancy supporting the coming to Bermuda for the wives and families. And Henry Vancy mentioned it was unfair for the Portuguese because they were the only foreigners that were discriminated this way. This discrimination against the bringing of wives and families didn't happen with the Germans, didn't happen with the Italians, with the Austrians, no one else but the Portuguese. And his quote from Royal Gazette, he told one of the nationals of Britain's oldest alive should be prevented from bringing their wives to Bermuda, while former enemies such as the Germans and Austrians were able to do so. 1959, this is just 14 years after World War II. Sorry, could you? And here is what Edward Richards, who later became the first black premier of Bermuda, said. He was a danger for community morality. So what happens is that with all of these Azorean living here years and years without seeing your wife, of course, you must remember, there are no emails, no WhatsApp, nothing. Just some letters once in a while when they were not busy. And so there were some Azoreans that had, in fact, started to have other families with Bermudians that they eventually met here. Unfortunately, only at the third time of Maurice Gibbons was submitting his proposal to the House of Assembly, they approved to bring the Portuguese wives, the Portuguese that came here before the agreement of 1957. So, for example, Mr. Amaral from Amaral Farms, he was lucky enough to have come before 1957, so it was possible for him to bring his wife in 1960. Just one example of a specific case. The same didn't happen, for example, with another person I interviewed, which was José Cabral, unfortunately passed away some days ago. He came after in 1958, so he couldn't bring his wife at this time. And of course, the other ones had to wait for 7 years before they could apply. And of course, here's a small picture at the right. This is Mrs. Fernandina Amaral and her daughter Maria de Jange. This picture was sent to José Amaral for him to know his daughter, because when he left the Azores, she was pregnant. And this is the kind of life and the struggles these people went through when they were coming here to Bermuda. So then in 1960s, this definitely was one of my favorite decades because of that personality, Filipe Macedo. And I did find a lot of stuff from him in Portugal mainland. And it's interesting how that man, he could just talk, and he just blames and hits hard the Board of Immigration and other people. And he would later be a great supporter of the immigrants and to denounce the abuses of the employers and even of the Board of Immigration. And one interesting thing is that he said that Bermuda always knew fresh Portuguese, because once they got status and once they got stayed here, they worked for themselves, started their own companies, and they worked for 12 or 14 or 16 hours. So Bermuda was constantly needing for new supply of fresh Portuguese. And that's what there was a certain time they only allowed single men, and then he complains that the people did more to immigrate were the married ones, not the single ones. And he even says in a very funny way, So Bermuda only allows single men, and then they send their wives here. So the problem, and he says, and they marry them here. And he knew, because he was a priest, he was the one marrying them here in Bermuda. And so, so he knew all about this stuff, how many of them were born in here in Bermuda, being baptized here in Bermuda. And so in 1964, they make negotiations for new agreements to import Portuguese labor. And Bermuda didn't want to bring their families, but of course, on this new contract, there were higher salaries than the previous agreement from 1957. And this is what I found in the Executive Council's minutes about them prepared to go to Lisbon and negotiate the new agreement with the Portuguese. No incentives shall be given to married men to bring their families to Bermuda, and that unless the Portuguese authorities raise the issue, it should not be addressed in the discussions of the new agreements. So if they don't talk about it, we avoid it, because we don't want that. Of course, we all know because of the space for schools, housing, and all these problems, because Bermuda is just 50 square kilometers. So he keeps to complain, and he says that people need to inspect the conditions on how the Portuguese are working, their conditions of housing, overtime, weekly rest, and of course wages. So at this time, for example, they were getting around 14 pounds a week working in hotels, and there were hotels that were paying 7 pounds a week or even less, and even putting them in places far away from their place of work and not paying extra hours. And of course, as he said, as Philippe said, after 1947, most of the abuses were being done by the hotels, paying less than minimum wage, and the Board of Immigration, side by side with the hotel associations, didn't allow the immigrants to change jobs, and even sometimes threatened them with deportation. And what happens is that the Portuguese in this time, and according to the contract of 1964, there were only 4 jobs they could do: farming, so agricultural labor, dairyman, hotels as pot washer, and gardening. So they could only change jobs between those 4, but many times they didn't allow them to change, like from hotels to farming or from hotels to dairy farms. So what he says is that the Board of Immigration was authorizing service for Portuguese tourists, so illegal immigration. No worries. And what I found also in the Portugal mainland is how other foreigners were visiting Bermuda and living in Bermuda. They started to see this. So, for example, I found an American called Joseph Busk that he asked the Portuguese Consul of New York to import 2 men that worked for him in Bermuda. He says that how good they were, and his word he says that the restrictions in Bermuda are almost inhuman against the Portuguese. This isn't basically by an American when he went back to New York. So in 1966, because of all of this issue not allowing women to come and children, the clergy of Bermuda, some different 3 churches, submitted a petition to the consul and the governor in Bermuda. It says prohibits the domicile in Bermuda of the wives and families of these workers is contrary to natural justice and Christian morality, and it's done in the public interest. And discriminates against the Azorean worker is comparison with other alien employees and imposes a natural hardship and unnecessary strain in their moral resources. So in 1967, because all of this is happening, the Executive Council asked the labor relations officers to examine the policy of the Board of Immigration and to see what was happening, if it was if it could work, like if it was sorry, that's not what I meant to say. If it was according to the recommendations, international recommendations for immigrant work. And according to recommendation number 58, the maximum period of service for employment involving a long and expensive journey on LLC should not exceed 2 years if the workers are not accompanied by their families, or 3 years if the workers are accompanied by their families. So 2 years. And Bermuda was putting them here and not allowing them to proceed to have their families for 7 years. They could only come for visits for 1 year, and then they had to go back. So in regard to against the Azoreans to bring their families, this is from a document I found in the Executive Council memos in the Bermuda archives, and here's what they say. Because of these recommendations, they were not sure if Bermuda was definitely discriminating Portuguese compared to the other foreigners. And so they asked, well, is it true? We need numbers. And here's what comes out in the Executive Council. With regard to discrimination against Portuguese contract workers by comparison with workers of other nationalities, the board has admitted that there is discrimination in policy against Portuguese. No other aliens are prevented as a matter of policy from being accompanied by their families. So meanwhile, foreign orders from the Portuguese government, Filipe Macedo was not allowing Portuguese workers to come to Bermuda. He just had the contracts in piles in the Portuguese council. He was not signing them, they were not coming, unless this problem was solved. So only in 1968, new agreement is reached. Wives can come after 6 months probation, there are no kids. Wife and kids can come after 2 years if there was adequate accommodation. That's what happened, for example, with Mr. Eduardo Medeiros, who was then the Portuguese president of the Portuguese Association of Bermuda. He brought his wife, and then in the late 60s, he brought his son and his wife, because he got this from this policy after this contract, in 1968. So 1970s, Portuguese consul Barreiros Martins, after many people come here, he bars immigration from the Azores because of some problems. And Bermudian employers need labor, so they go for Ecuador for labor. Didn't work out much, because once the Azoreans started to come again, the Ecuadors, after the contracts were finished, were sent back and the Azoreans stayed. And then in 1972, the Bermudian delegation goes to Lisbon to negotiate new agreements. This delegation was chaired by the Minister John C.V. Woolridge, and with him went Luis Bernardo as a translator, so a member of the Azorean Portuguese community. So 1970s, here is something very interesting. So after making them working extra hours and not paying those hours, in the 70s they were desperate for Portuguese labor. And also I will use from here a lot of pictures for you to see, dipping in the highlights of what happened in the next decades. So after 1972, the policy was for Portuguese to come, but only 2 kids. They will only bring to Bermuda 2 kids. Of course, there were Portuguese that went around and said it was not their kids, but they eventually got here to Bermuda. But Maria Borges was a lady that she had 10 kids, and she came here to Bermuda and brought 8 of them. And then what happens, that the contract was made to her husband, but he passed away. He passes away, and so the contract was made in his name. So the Board of Immigration says, you have to leave Bermuda, because your husband has passed away. And she applies, she tries to stay. They even made a petition with 1,000 signatures for this lady to stay. Amongst those signatures, many Bermudians, but still the Board of Immigration keeps his decision, because they say if we allow her to stay, more of them will want to stay on this way with this amount of people. And of course, again, the problems of schools and the hotels, etc. And then also in the late 70s and mid 70s, some Portuguese started to leave Bermuda because of the contract of 1972 and the previous ones. So the 4 jobs that they could do were the same: gardening, pot washer, dairy farms, and gardening. No matter how much their kids studied, because they didn't have status, they could only apply as immigrants for those professions. And here is what that gentleman over there, Mariano da Costa, said: I came to Bermuda to give a better life for my kids. If they don't have a better life here, I'm leaving Bermuda. They left for Canada. That's what happened with that. And also, just forgot to mention one detail about the restrictions against the Portuguese and bringing their wives and kids, was because they were the majority of the immigrants. They were the bigger number of immigrants was the Portuguese, and at the same time the problem of the language. So Americans wasn't any problem for them to come here for your kids, but Portuguese was a problem. And the schools needed different teachers to have more attention. In 1977, we have Monta Amaral, first president of Azores in Bermuda. He is reading over there, Mrs. Lewis Brown Evans and Luis Bernardo in the middle. 1978, and something that shocked the Azorean and Bermudian community, Connie Furtado, a small girl that was raped and killed here in Bermuda. And then also in 79, Luis Bernardo and Ed Mel get a medal from the ambassador Vasco Pereira. They were the first Portuguese to get here, in Bermuda, to get some medals. So in the 1980s, we have something that made Bermuda go to the Azores, if you allow me to say it this way. So January the 1st, there was a huge earthquake in the island of Terceira, killed many people, destroyed a huge part of the island, of the city. And so Bermuda donates a total of $60,000 to the Azores, Azorean and Portuguese community. Amongst those 60,000, 10,000 are from the Bermudian government. So right here we have the Azores Relief Center at the time, over there in the middle. Well, that's Luis Bernardo again, and he was amongst the Red Cross, and of course also that time Portuguese Association. And then to give this money, Mr. David Gibbons, Premier at the time, or his wife, go to the Azores to give this check of $60,000 to help the Azores. And this was the first visit of a Premier of Bermuda to the Azores. He's over there in San Miguel Island, and the other one, I'm pretty sure it's Terceira Island, the one that was damaged by the earthquakes. So in the 1980s, also very important that Montreal travels again to Bermuda, and was a courtesy trip. So I need to thank how Gibbons came here went to the Azores in the previous year. In 1982, they signed the new agreement in Bermuda between the authorities of the Azores, Portugal, and Bermuda. At the time, the delegation from Bermuda was the chairman was Mr. Tony Correa. And with this agreement, Portuguese started to be able to apply for other jobs rather than those 4 categories that are there. So only in 1982 that this discrimination against nationality ended, was finished, only in 1982. All the other foreigners, if they could come here for open category jobs, of course, they could apply. But if they were Portuguese, they couldn't. Only in 1982 this finishes, and also in 1982 this agreement establishes the commitment between the two governments to teach Portuguese in Bermuda at the level of primary school and high school, and also in these decades. 1983, Premier John Swan visits the Azores, and he was the third one or second. And in 1987, Benfica, that's a big soccer team, comes to Bermuda, and was a huge event.
Who won that game?
Who won? He won against the Bermuda national team. At the time also came Eusébio, a very famous Portuguese soccer player. So in the 1990s, that was a very decade. That was a decade hard to write about because all the problems were coming up. So in the 1990s, there is some economic recess in Bermuda, and according to the Portuguese Bermuda, according to the Bermuda government, Portuguese were not being sent back home by the Bermuda government. And what happens is that many parents didn't register their children. So we had these people that were born here in Bermuda and they were not Portuguese citizens. And so what happens is that because of economic recess, many of them lost their jobs, and older Bermudans that were Bermudans, they had Bermuda status, were applying to their jobs, was giving the work to them because the policy in immigration is Bermudians first, of course. And so, of course, because they were not Bermudian, they couldn't get jobs, and so many of them just started to go back home to the Azores. And of course, this was especially hard for them because their kids didn't speak much Portuguese, most of them. So in this time, Portuguese Bermuda Organization, PBL, was formed as a pressure group, first led by John Amaral and then by Ana Faria, and this Portuguese Bermudian Organization then succeeded to some of their goals, to lower from 21 to 18 the age to apply to Bermuda status in this time, which is something that helped them a lot, especially because of, so 18 they can already work, and they didn't have to wait those 3 years, etc. And also, thank you. According to the minister, Ivan Pierman, Portuguese were not being treated differently. Many were living because they couldn't get other jobs, and so they just decided to go back home. Of course, in this time, also who came to defend, to talk about and to support these immigrants was the lawyer Portuguese descent Trevor Moniz, alongside with the Portuguese Bermudian Organization. And so here's what Irving Pierman shows up in the archives, what I found out. So I could only research until 1992 because of the last 30 years, though that we can do research. So in 1980, Portuguese were 12% of the foreign population living in Bermuda, but in 1998, they were around 18% of the foreigners who got status. So they got more status than the percentage they were represented. And in 1989, 53 Azorean Portuguese children got status, making them the most benefited children of the long-term resident children's amendment. And here's what Pierman says, because the press at the time definitely was butchering in pieces the Bermudian government over this topic. And he says, we have been accused of sending Portuguese workers back to the Azores, but this is simply not true. Those who have left have done so of their own free will. There are a few exceptions, of course, in construction and other situations that he mentions. But as I said, in fact, we have discovered a number of Portuguese people are living while their work permit are still valid, and in some cases, will not have expired until 1993. So, coming to the 21st century, we have Bermuda as the #1 destiny of immigrants according to the Azorean records of immigration. Not the United States, not Canada, Bermuda. It's, of course, we don't have, I asked them for data about EU, but there is no data for EU. So Bermuda, even nowadays, is #1 destiny of immigrants of the Azores. So in 2002, with the PLP government, we had the long-term residence bill, which gave status to 400 non-Bermudians, of course, amongst them Portuguese, and of course, from the 21st century, just highlighting the Azorean president's college status to visit Bermuda. There was a pathway to a status bill that didn't get approved because there were some protests, and so OBA got back and withdrew the law. In 2018, with the PLP government again, they celebrated 170 years of Portuguese in Bermuda, and of course, they had the holiday to celebrate this Portuguese president in Bermuda. So I'm almost finishing my presentation of my research of all I've done. And so here's the topics I also found. I also wrote about so far in the book: Portuguese, a third race in Bermuda. So first of all, Portuguese, of course, as you all know, it's not a race, it's a nationality. But it's, of course, just like on the West Indies, they were discriminated, and the white people, white Anglo-Saxon, that's what I meant to say, Anglo-Saxon, were more higher, like socially and economically, wanted to distance themselves from the Portuguese, so they divided this society in black, white, and Portuguese. And what I found was even some articles mentioning this. So 1920s, there were job advertisements, white or Portuguese. 1950s, Portuguese separated from other whites. And I really found out this very funny how Mrs. Ana Faria said, Bermuda has its own magical way of transforming the Portuguese nationality into a separate race of its own. And she also explains what happened this. And of course, I use all his quotes over here from Dennis Ferguson, where he said, I was considered Portuguese, not white. Call me Guy or Portuguese, for some of these words. And as a youth growing up in Bermuda, for example, that's from a friend of mine, I always felt discrimination. So much so, I was embarrassed to be Portuguese growing up. And even also from our gentleman over here, Jeff Soda, I go to major cities of the world, Toronto, New York, and London. Get off that plane, I'm a white guy. I get off the plane at LFW Airport, I'm a Portuguese. I'm no longer white. And of course, there were all of these issues around the race, but this didn't happen as it showed. Bermuda, it's not the only case. This happened in the West Indies. This happened in the U.S. as well. So, for example, I even found a joke online. I was talking about Portuguese. And I can tell you that's joke, of course. it's funny. So about these Portuguese, and they say there's Santa Claus, there's Easter Bunny, and there's a smart Portuguese walking down the streets. There's a dollar bill. Who catches first? None of them, because there's no such thing as Santa Claus, Easter Bunny, or smart Portuguese. But so of course there were these jokes. These were part of this discrimination. Against Portuguese in the U.S., in Bermuda, and in West Indies. So last but not least, the Azorean Portuguese mark in Bermuda. Of course, starting with the economy, we have landscaping, we have farming over there. That's a company from José Cabral, the farming, Pacheco Farms. in D&J construction, Piggly Wiggly that would later become Marketplace, Music Box with Eddie DeMello. These were his record brands, Mark, Dwayne Records, Joe Vieira Trucks. And then of course we're talking about culture and clubs and associations. So here we have the oldest one, 1936. I really found the exact date. The Vasco da Gama was born on June the 16th of 1936. Already sent it to Richard Ambrosi to correct this wrong date. And of course, the oldest club in Portuguese Clarion they created because they were not allowed in certain clubs. Portuguese were not allowed in certain golf courses just because they had Portuguese surnames. In fact, I found also related with discrimination. I found an article about a gentleman. I don't remember his surname, but he says, "I cannot go to certain golf course just because I have a Portuguese surname. So if I invite someone, and just in case they have a Portuguese surname, they cannot go. But if my daughter marries a British and she becomes, I don't know, Outerbridge, then she can get it. But she doesn't have she is of Portuguese blood, but doesn't have a Portuguese name." And they complain about this. And then, of course, after these families come here, we start, in 1970 comes up Portuguese Association of Bermuda, which is first Portuguese Association started to provide scholarships for kids to go to study because they saw that there were many people here that could were intelligent but didn't have the chance to study, and so they formed out the Portuguese Association. So then later, Portuguese Association was formed. In 1982, they formed up the Portuguese Cultural Center. It was formed because of the Portuguese school. So Fernando Betancourt was from the Azores. He came specifically from the Azores because most of the community are Azoreans. And here's something you probably don't know. So when I came here to Bermuda, and I knew, of course, was 95% Azoreans, I was surprised there was a Portuguese school. I'm going to explain why. So if you go to Canada, around 60% of the Portuguese population in Canada are from the Azores. But around only 10 and 15% of the students in the Portuguese schools are from the Azores. And for a simple reason. Azoreans, when they went to the US and Canada, they went and they never wanted to go back. And so what happens is that gentleman over there, Eduardo Medeiros, that was very involved in this creation of the Portuguese school alongside with Padre Mendes, he is the one who explained, well, what happened was it was not stable. People came here to Bermuda, just signed contracts, and maybe the next day next year had to move back. So they needed their kids to learn how Portuguese, because one day they were going back to the Azores. And that's the main reasons why we have a Portuguese school in definitely predominantly Azorean immigrant community. And of course, last but not least, more recently, created in 2015, the Casa dos Jesus of Bermuda, the most recent association in Bermuda. And also, of course, talking about culture, here's some stuff that I highlighted. Gastronomy, so food, malassada, chorizo, and many other foods that are nowadays part red bean soup. They are part of the Portuguese culture, Bermudian culture. In the 1930s, I found a lot of Portuguese movies coming to Bermuda, and this was a way to keep in contact with the Portuguese culture. And then, of course, I only started to see more these things, these cultural events after the 70s, and for a simple reason. If there were not the wives here, these people were just working. They didn't socialize much. So only after the 60s and the 70s, that's when Portuguese started to form their folklore groups. First performance of a folklore group was in 1979. Only the presence in the Bermuda Day was much earlier, in the 50s. Holy Ghost feasts only started in the 1990s celebrations compared to 1800s celebrations in the US, and even Santo Cristo, the procession in the 90s, it's 1978, the feast, while in the US they were already celebrating in the beginning of 1900s. And also, of course, Azorean culture, as you can see, is so connected with Catholicism. So if there was also a community that split between Protestants and Catholics, this of course damaged and didn't enable for Azorians to have these all celebrations here in Bermuda. Thank you very much for your attention.
Just bring Eduardo an extra glass of water. We're actually going to have an opportunity for questions, if you have any.
Do you have a piece of paper in?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and a
I'll
pen.
grab you a pen. And there's going to be a roaming mic.
I used to teach in the public education system, and I wasn't aware there was ever Portuguese taught in the schools except for an after-school club.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
yeah, a lot of people don't
Yes.
they
And-
hear that
and
and
the-
they think something different, like it's an option, like French or Spanish, but it's not, never has been.
And there was some just in this century in Bermuda College, but then didn't last nowadays. No. So it was always just like in the Western Canada in those schools, after school, which is it doesn't help much the students because it's a school after school, and so there damages their focus to learn Portuguese and to be able and to like those classes. Any more questions or comments?
If I can just add to that,
We both worked at the same school for some time. The schools tried to get teachers for Portuguese, but there were no qualified teachers and nobody else willing to undertake it during the school days, so they couldn't schedule the language. But we had people like Penny Fawkes who went away to Portugal for a year and learned the language and came back and taught it. So, thank you.
Yes, it's true. They also had struggle in finding sometimes, yes, in some years.
Is there any other questions? Oh.
Good evening, everyone.
Hey.
My name is Eduardo Medeiros. I was quite surprised to see a quote there for me tonight. Yes, I was that kid that was embarrassed to be Portuguese when I was very young.
Yes, I took that from our interview.
Yes, I didn't know that you would be quoting me on that. I'm not being too embarrassed to admit it. But I'd first like to observe the event this evening. I'd like to thank the government and also Minister Owen Darrell, along with his colleague MP Shay Adams, for supporting this event here tonight. We are, in fact, one Bermuda of many different races and cultural backgrounds, which we can be very, very proud of all that we have achieved. But I did have a question for you, and that was, I'm not sure if we discussed this in the past, but it's surrounding the names. I'm a Medeiros and a proud Medeiros, but I spell my name M-E, of which, much probably to the chagrin of our colleague here, William Medeiros, you may probably learn tonight that he in fact spells his name incorrectly.
For sure.
I say that in jest only because... Not according to my father. Not according to your father. I say that in jest only because many of the names have been changed, not just in this case, M-E and M-E. In fact, I have a funny story. The first passport that I remember looking at with my name on it was I was around age 10, and we were going to Canada because my mother, whose brother who was with me at the time, was a American Canadian citizen. And I looked at it and it was strange to me because it said M-E. Now I say that's strange because I remember having a conversation with my dad, and all my all my report cards from Harrington Sound School had M-A. And I thought I was a Medeiros. And it was my father that said to me, "Why does all your report cards say Medeiros?" I said, "I don't know, because someone told me my name is Medeiros." So the question I had was, why the name changes? We know, for example, when folks, like a lot of Jewish folks, when they go from Europe to Canada in the U.S., they change their names because of persecution. You know, Greenstein became Green, and so on and so forth. There are a lot of whites here who became Brancos, and Brancos became whites, and so on and so forth. Do you have any history of the name changes other than perhaps illiteracy?
So what happens that many times they didn't even know how to write their own names. That's one thing. The other one was an attempt to anglicize their own names, like from Machado to Marshall, and from Branco to White, and from many other translations, from Faria to Ferries, and many other ones. The other reason, that happened with surnames and names as well. So give you an example. Do you remember that guy I talked about that on the Manuel Cordeiro Benevides started Evangelical Church? So his son was called Antonio Cordeiro Benevides. So Antonio, that's Anthony in Portuguese. But here's how people from San Miguel say. They don't say Antonio, they say Antonio. Antonio. And so instead of writing Antonio, they write Antone. So that's not correct. But how people from San Miguel speak fast and not the best Portuguese, I must say sometimes. The Bermudians heard and they just wrote what they heard. And so that's what happened many times with their surnames and common and normal names as well. So M-E-A and M-E, I was surprised as well too. First time I heard that M-A-M-D was in Bermuda, and one lady asked me my name. I said Eduardo Medeiros, and she asked me M-A or M-E. I was shocked. M-A, that doesn't exist. And there you go. I hope I answered your question. That lady over there, she had it.
Any reason, you might have explained, but any reason why, any reason why the switch, why the Azores became the Azores as opposed to Madeira?
Because of the U.S. United States. They were living on the United States, this connection, the ships coming from the U.S. to Bermuda. There is a huge Azorean community in the U.S., Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and on the other side in California as well. And tell you even more, there is also, of course, people, this is just like 5% of the book that's here. And for example, Bermuda once had a plan in the 1900s, 1910s, to import people, Azorean people, not from the Azores, but from the Azorean communities. They were closer, and they could already speak English. So there was definitely a good idea, but never came to life because they were already settled there.
I was going to say one other
Please.
question. Did you examine the relationships between Black Bermudians and Azorean and Portuguese?
That's the thing. So, of course, the focus, as you saw in my presentation, the focus of the book, especially on immigration. But yes, there were many Portuguese and Azoreans that married Bermudians, and that's why we talk about the 25%. So with 25% of Bermudian population that's of Portuguese descent, many of them it's mixed. The one black person that had a grandparent that was Portuguese, and that's why we reach up to 25%. So, of course, I have many topics on this book, and it's something I'm going to mention also in those relationships they had with other women here. That applies and to that case, and even other people that just came single. And the passport records, and that's something I'm going to put in the book, as already talked with Andrew Moniz, that I have the record passports from late 1880s until 1973. So in Portugal, it's 50 years to do the research, so I couldn't go much closer. And there were many of them that came single. So many of them came single and went back to the Azores, married, and then came back again. So these people were going back and forth, and even going to California and Hawaii and coming back, the Azores, Bermuda, that was doing this. And some of them came single and eventually stayed. And I've met many Bermudians that are descendants from Black Bermudians and from Portuguese. Yes, that's a very interesting question. Thank you.
I actually have a question on those lines. Is that anecdotally I know of at least one woman who, she's in her 90s, who emigrated as a single woman to marry in Bermuda. Was there much immigration of women, Portuguese women, to Bermuda, or was it always only men?
Mostly, 1920s families and single men, but was some single woman, yes. But that's a very interesting story right there. She was 90s?
She's in her 90s, yeah.
Oh, she's in her 90s.
Yes, she's in her 90s.
Okay, in her husband is Bermudian or Azorean?
No, Bermudian. So she came to marry
It was effectively arranged.
Yeah, so here's another story I'm going to tell you. I have an aunt that's in the 80s, and my mom always tells this story because it's very funny. And one day she gets in her bedroom and she's taking pictures of her, and she says, "What are all those pictures for?" "Oh, I'm getting a boyfriend in Canada." So this was a way that people did to get to Canada and US and Bermuda. They found out these arranged marriages just to emigrate, and so that happened as well. Yes.
And a lot of people would marry by proxy. They knew each other, and then they wouldn't even be in the same country, and they would marry,
Yeah.
and the women would come to Bermuda.
I have friends who the father was here and then they married by proxy and then came here. I just wanted to make sort of a comment. You probably know this, but the reason a lot of Portuguese people became Protestant, my grandmother came here in 1923. She was one of the kids that were mentioned. Yeah, they came on the Orbita, the name of the boat.
No, then it was later. It was not at one. 1923, there were two ships, Asia and Orbita.
Yeah, sorry. And anyway, so the Portuguese were here and they wanted to worship, but there weren't any Catholic churches allowed in Bermuda. And so a lot of, we didn't have first Catholic church, was in Hamilton and St. Edward's. And a lot of people didn't live that close, so they had to either not go to church or go somewhere else to worship. And that was another reason why a lot of people became Protestant.
Yes, and even, as I said, to socialize with our Portuguese as well, because they knew there were Portuguese already in the Portuguese evangelical church, so it was a way to integrate themselves in the Bermudian society, Portuguese Bermudian society.
You made one mention of the Cabo Verde community.
Yes.
Did your research reveal anything further? Is that something in terms of research?
Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the chance to go to Cape Verde for the archives. What I found there was a lady over here I interviewed who was once in the archives, and she heard me speaking, and then I later interviewed her. Her grandfather or great-grandfather came to Bermuda on a whaling ship, American whaling ship. So there were many Azoreans and Cape Verdeans that got everywhere. There are Azoreans that arrived at Alaska on American whaling ships. So they could easily get to Bermuda on American whaling ships, no doubt about it. And of course, some Cape Verdeans did arrive on American whaling ships, and even some of them made comments that whaling could be a good industry in Bermuda. And I don't have records of passports from Cape Verde to Bermuda, but just there were some specific cases. What I do mention is that, for example, this lady, that her grandparents or grandparents came on her whaling ship, she gave me the names of the families that came with him. So these were all young men that got in on a whaling ship, and once they stopped in Bermuda, they just stayed. And that happened a lot. The immigration, Azorean immigration to the US started illegally, more amongst on American whaling ships. American whaling ships went to the Azores, hunted our beautiful whales that we like nowadays to show on whale watching, and Azoreans went with them, and then they just stayed in the US when they got back. The whaling ships got back. So Cape Verdeans got here like that, that way to Bermuda.